Building manager banned my wheelchair wife from using elevator, unaware she's a retired judge. Opening bombshell: what I'm about to tell you is absolutely insane. And I guarantee you've never heard a revenge story quite like this one. A power-hungry building manager decided to ban my disabled wife from using our own elevator because he thought she was just another helpless victim he could push around. But here's what this arrogant fool didn't know. He had just picked a fight with someone who had spent 30 years sending criminals to federal prison. Someone who knew the law better than most attorneys, and someone who had connections that could destroy his entire life with a single phone call. By the time this story is over, this man went from thinking he was untouchable to wearing federal prison stripes. And the way my wife orchestrated his complete destruction is absolutely brilliant. Trust me, you need to hear every single shocking detail of how one wheelchair-bound woman brought down an entire corrupt management system, using nothing but her knowledge of federal law and some very powerful friends. The perfect life before everything changed. My name is David Patterson, and for 15 years, my wife Sarah and I had been living what we thought was our dream life in a luxury condominium complex in downtown Seattle. Our unit on the 8th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows with breathtaking views of Elliott Bay, hardwood floors throughout, and most importantly for us, a wheelchair. For 30 years, she had been one of the most respected federal judges in the Pacific Northwest, known for her sharp legal mind, unwavering integrity, and tough but fair approach to justice. Attorneys would travel from across the country to argue cases in her courtroom, and her legal opinions had been cited in Supreme Court decisions. Sarah was a legal powerhouse, a woman who commanded respect from everyone who met her. But 3 years ago, everything changed. Sarah was diagnosed with a rare spinal condition that progressively weakened her legs until she could no longer walk. The transition to using a wheelchair was devastating for her, not just physically, but emotionally. This was a woman who had climbed mountains, run marathons, and commanded federal courtrooms with her presence. Suddenly, she found herself dependent on mobility aids and facing a world full of barriers she had never noticed before. However, if there's one thing I learned about Sarah during our 25 years of marriage, it's that she doesn't stay down for long. She approached her disability the same way she had approached every challenge in her life, with determination, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to be defeated. She retired from the bench with full honors, but she didn't retreat from life. Instead, she began volunteering with disability rights organizations, mentoring young attorneys, and writing legal briefs for civil rights cases. The calm before the storm. Our building was perfect for Sarah's new reality, with wide hallways, accessible bathrooms in all common areas, and most importantly, reliable elevators that gave her independence. But all of that was about to change when a new building manager arrived, and this man's hatred for disabled residents would ultimately lead to his complete destruction in ways. With 48 units, a beautiful courtyard, a fitness center, and a rooftop garden, the residents were a mix of young professionals, empty nesters, and retirees, and we had always gotten along well with everyone. The previous building manager, Helen Rodriguez, had been wonderful, professional, helpful, and always willing to work with residents to solve problems. But Helen retired 6 months ago, and the management company brought in her replacement, Marcus Wellington. From the moment I met Marcus, I knew we were going to have problems. He was a short, balding man, in his early 40s, with beady eyes and a permanent scowl. He carried a clipboard everywhere, like it was a badge of authority. And he had this way of looking at people, like they were personally inconveniencing him by existing. Marcus made it clear from day one that things were going to change under his management. He called a mandatory building meeting in his first week and stood at the front of the community room like a dictator addressing his subjects. I want everyone to understand that the previous management was far too lenient, he announced, his voice dripping with self-importance. I've been brought in to restore order and discipline to this building. From now on, every rule will be enforced to the letter, and there will be consequences for violations. Sarah and I exchanged glances. We had never had any problems with the previous management, and we couldn't imagine what violations he was referring to. The first warning, Sigenus Marcus wasted no time in making his presence felt. Within his first month, he had issued noise complaints against 3 different residents for excessive footsteps, implemented new restrictions on guest parking that made it nearly impossible for visitors to find spaces, and began patrolling the building like a security guard, looking for trouble. But it was his attitude toward the building's older and disabled residents that really caught our attention. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who used a walker, mentioned to Sarah that Marcus had made several comments about her slow movement in the hallways. Mr. Rodriguez, who was legally blind and used a white cane, told us that Marcus had questioned whether he really needed to use the elevator for just 2 floors. The target is acquired, but Marcus's real obsession was about to become clear. And when he set his sights on Sarah, he had no idea he was targeting someone who could destroy his career, his freedom, and his entire future with the knowledge she carried in her head. The first direct incident happened on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah was heading down to meet her physical therapist in the lobby when Marcus appeared in the hallway outside our unit. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice taking on that condescending tone we were starting to recognize. "I need to discuss something with you." "Of course," Sarah replied politely. "What can I help you with?" Marcus glanced down at his ever-present clipboard. "I've been monitoring elevator usage patterns, and I've noticed that you use the elevator more frequently than other residents. Yesterday alone, you made 6 trips." Sarah looked at him with the same calm expression she used to give attorneys who were about to make fools of themselves in her courtroom. "Yes, Mr. Wellington. I went to physical therapy in the morning, returned for lunch, went to a doctor's appointment in the afternoon, and came back home. Later, my husband and I went to dinner, and then we returned. That's normal daily life for someone who lives on the 8th floor." "Well," Marcus continued, clearly enjoying what he thought was a position of power, "other residents have been complaining about elevator wait times. I think you need to be more mindful of how often you're using the elevator." The legal mind, activates. Now most people in Sarah's situation might have felt intimidated or embarrassed, but Marcus had just made his first crucial mistake. He had started a legal battle with someone who had spent 3 decades studying, interpreting, and enforcing federal law. Sarah's response was measured and precise. "Mr. Wellington, are you suggesting that I should limit my use of the elevator in my own building because of my disability?" Marcus, clearly not understanding the legal landmine he had just stepped on, doubled down. "I'm suggesting that all residents need to be considerate of others. Maybe you could plan your trips more efficiently. I see, Sarah said quietly. And are you making similar requests of other residents, or just those who use wheelchairs? I'm just trying to manage the building efficiently, Marcus replied. But I could see him starting to look uncomfortable. Sarah nodded slowly. Thank you for clarifying your position, Mr. Wellington. I'll be sure to document this conversation. The word document seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. His confident expression faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. There's no need for documentation, he said quickly. I'm just asking for cooperation. But it was too late. Sarah had already recognized what was happening. The investigation begins that evening. Sarah made a phone call that would ultimately send Marcus to federal prison. But he wouldn't realize what he had unleashed until it was far too late to save himself. David, Sarah said to me after Marcus had walked away, that man just violated federal housing law in the most obvious way possible. He specifically targeted me for my disability and suggested that I should limit my access to building amenities because of my wheelchair use. What are you going to do? I asked. Sarah smiled, and it was the same smile she used to give right before delivering a verdict that would change someone's life forever. I'm going to let him dig his own grave, but first, I need to make some calls. That evening, Sarah spent hours on the phone with former colleagues, disability rights attorneys, and federal investigators. You see, even in retirement, Sarah maintained close relationships with people throughout the legal system. Her reputation as a fair but tough judge had earned her respect from prosecutors, defense attorneys, and civil rights advocates alike. Her first call was to Jennifer Rodriguez, her former law clerk, who now worked as a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights violations. Jennifer's voice was warm with affection. How are you? How's retirement treating you? Actually, Jen, I'm calling because I need some advice. I think I'm dealing with housing discrimination based on my disability. The warmth in Jennifer's voice immediately shifted to professional concern. Tell me everything. As Sarah recounted the conversation with Marcus, I could hear Jennifer's sharp intake of breath through the phone. Sarah, this is textbook Fair Housing Act violation. If he continues this pattern of behavior, he could face federal criminal charges. The building could lose federal tax credits and face massive civil penalties. The network Immobilsas' second call was to Michael Chen, a disability rights attorney, who had argued several cases before her court and had always impressed her with his thorough preparation and passionate advocacy. Judge Patterson. Michael's voice was excited. What an honor to hear from you. How can I help? After Sarah explained the situation, Michael was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly serious. Sarah, I've been handling disability discrimination cases for 15 years, and what you're describing is one of the most clear-cut violations I've ever heard. This building manager is not just breaking building policies, he's violating federal law. If you're willing to pursue this, I would be honored to represent you pro bono. The trap is set, but Sarah wasn't ready to reveal her hand yet. She had a much more sophisticated plan in mind, one that would not only stop Marcus's discrimination, but expose a pattern of violations that could send him to prison for years. Michael, Sarah said, I want to build an airtight case. That means I need more evidence, and I need to see if there's a pattern of discrimination against other residents. What do you have in mind? Sarah's legal strategist mind was already working. I'm going to let him continue discriminating against me while I document everything. Meanwhile, I want you to help me investigate whether he's been violating other residents' rights. That's brilliant, Michael replied. If we can establish a pattern of willful discrimination, the federal penalties increase dramatically. Sarah's third call was to Agent Patricia Williams, a federal investigator with the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, who had worked with Sarah on several cases during her time on the bench. Sarah Patterson. Patricia's voice was genuinely pleased. I heard about your retirement. How are you adjusting? I'm calling because I think I need to report a civil rights violation, Sarah said. The change in Patricia's tone was immediate and professional. What kind of violation? As Sarah described Marcus's behavior, Patricia's questions became increasingly detailed and focused. Sarah, based on what you're telling me, this could be a federal criminal case. Housing discrimination based on disability is something we take very seriously. If this building manager is systematically violating residents' civil rights, he's looking at serious federal charges. The documentation, STRATHY Sarah, developed a comprehensive plan to document Marcus's discrimination. She installed a discreet recording app on her phone, legal in Washington state, with single-party consent, and began keeping detailed written records of every interaction. She also reached out to other residents to understand the scope of Marcus's discriminatory behavior. The pattern emerges. What Sarah discovered was far worse than she had imagined. Marcus wasn't just discriminating against her, he was systematically violating the civil rights of multiple residents, and his actions were about to trigger a federal investigation that would expose years of illegal behavior. Through discreet conversations with neighbors, Sarah discovered a disturbing pattern. Mrs. Eleanor Chen, the 78-year-old woman who used a walker, told Sarah that Marcus had repeatedly complained about her slow movement in hallways and had suggested she might be more comfortable in an assisted living facility. James Rodriguez, the legally blind resident, revealed that Marcus had questioned the legitimacy of his guide dog and had tried to charge him additional pet fees despite federal law clearly exempting service animals. Maria Santos, who suffered from severe arthritis and sometimes used a wheelchair, said Marcus had blocked her from using the building's pool during certain hours, claiming it was for safety reasons. Dr. Robert Kim, a veteran who used a prosthetic leg, reported that Marcus had made inappropriate comments about his disability and had questioned whether he should be living in a building with stairs despite the presence of elevators. Most shockingly, Sarah learned that Marcus had been keeping a list of residents with disabilities and had been systematically targeting them with complaints, restrictions, and harassment. The federal laws in PLAY's, a former federal judge, Sarah knew exactly which laws Marcus was violating. The Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination in housing based on disability and requires reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which ensures equal access to public accommodations and services. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which prohibits discrimination in federally funded programs. Federal civil rights statutes that make it a criminal offense to willfully violate someone's civil rights based on their disability. Each violation carried potential criminal penalties, including federal prison time, and Marcus was racking up violations daily. The escalation Marcus was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. One that would provide federal prosecutors with everything they needed to file criminal charges and send him to prison for years. 2 weeks after the initial elevator conversation, Sarah was returning from a medical appointment when she found an official-looking notice taped to our door. The notice, printed on building letterhead and signed by Marcus Wellington, read, "Notice of Policy, VIO on Tenant, Sarah Patterson. Excessive use of building elevators, causing inconvenience to other residents and increased maintenance costs. Required action, effective immediately. Tenant is limited to 4 elevator trips per day. Additional usage will result in fines and potential eviction proceedings. This policy is being implemented to ensure fair access to building amenities for all residents." Sarah read the notice twice, then looked up at me with that dangerous smile. "I knew so well, David," she said calmly. "Would you mind helping me scan this document? I think the FBI is going to find it very interesting." The smoking Guillaume Marcus had just provided Sarah with documented proof of deliberate, willful discrimination based on disability. But more than that, he had created a written policy that violated multiple federal laws and could be used as evidence in a criminal prosecution. "This is it," Sarah told me, as she carefully preserved the notice. "This document alone is enough to file federal charges. He's created a written policy that specifically discriminates against me because of my wheelchair use, and he's threatening illegal eviction if I don't comply." Sarah immediately forwarded copies of the notice to Michael Chen, Jennifer Rodriguez, and Agent Patricia Williams. The response was swift and unanimous. Marcus Wellington had just confessed to federal crimes in writing. The federal response, within 48 hours of receiving Sarah's documentation, federal law enforcement was mobilizing resources that would completely destroy Marcus's life. But he still had no idea what was coming for him. Agent Patricia Williams called Sarah personally. "Sarah, I've reviewed all your documentation, and I've never seen such clear evidence of willful civil rights violations. We're opening a formal federal investigation, and I suspect this is going to uncover violations affecting multiple residents." Michael Chen filed formal complaints with the Department of Housing and Urban Development (HUD), the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and the Washington State Human Rights Commission. Jennifer Rodriguez began preparing federal criminal charges, telling Sarah, "This is one of the strongest discrimination cases I've ever seen. The written notice alone is enough for criminal prosecution. But combined with the pattern of behavior you've documented, this man is looking at serious federal prison time." The investigation, EXPND's federal agents began interviewing every resident in the building. What they discovered was a systematic pattern of discrimination that went far beyond what Sarah had initially uncovered. Marcus had been keeping detailed files on residents with disabilities, noting their medical conditions, mobility aids, and daily routines. He had been timing their elevator usage, monitoring their visitor patterns, and creating policies specifically designed to make their lives more difficult. The agents also discovered that Marcus had been stealing federal tax credits, meant to ensure building accessibility, while simultaneously violating the very laws that made those credits possible. The confession, but Marcus's biggest mistake was yet to come, and when federal agents interviewed him, his own words would provide prosecutors with everything they needed to send him to prison for years. When federal agents arrived to interview Marcus, he initially tried to play the victim. He claimed that residents were making false accusations and that he was just trying to manage the building efficiently. But as the interview progressed, Marcus's true feelings about people with disabilities began to emerge. "Look," Marcus told the agents, apparently believing he could charm his way out of trouble. "These people with wheelchairs and walkers, they just expect special treatment for everything. They move slowly, they take up extra space, they require accommodations that cost money. Honestly, they should probably live in specialized facilities instead of regular apartment buildings." Agent Williams later told Sarah, "In 30 years of investigating civil rights violations, I've rarely heard such a clear confession to discriminatory intent. This man literally told us that he believes people with disabilities don't deserve equal housing rights." But Marcus wasn't done incriminating himself. "That Patterson woman," he continued, apparently unaware that every word was being recorded, "she uses that elevator constantly, multiple times a day. It's excessive, and it's not fair to other residents. I was well within my rights to limit her usage. I don't need lawyers to tell me how to manage my building. These disability laws are just excuses for people to get special treatment." The criminal charges, based on Marcus's own statements and the evidence Sarah had gathered. Federal prosecutors filed criminal charges under multiple federal statutes: conspiracy to violate civil rights, 18 U.S.C. Section 241, willful deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, Fair Housing Act violations, 42 U.S.C. Section 3631, fraud related to federal tax credits. Each charge carried potential penalties of up to 10 years in federal prison. The building management panics when the building's ownership company learned about the federal investigation. Their response was swift and panicked as they realized that Marcus's actions could bankrupt them and result in criminal charges for the entire organization. The building was owned by Pacific Northwest Property Management, a company that managed dozens of buildings throughout the region. When news of the federal investigation reached the company's executives, emergency meetings were called. Crisis management consultants were hired, and teams of attorneys were assembled. The company's legal team quickly realized the scope of their potential liability. Not only were they facing massive federal fines and the loss of federal tax credits, but they could also face criminal charges if federal prosecutors determined that the company had knowledge of or participated in the discrimination. Within 72 hours of the federal charges being filed, Pacific Northwest Property Management took decisive action. Marcus Wellington was immediately terminated and banned from all company properties. A new building manager with extensive fair housing training was hired. The company agreed to pay for comprehensive accessibility improvements to the building. All building policies were reviewed by civil rights attorneys and rewritten to ensure compliance with federal law. A resident advisory committee was established with mandatory presentation from residents with disabilities. The media ADT's word of the case began to spread through the legal community, and soon local media picked up the story. The headline in the Seattle Times read, "Federal charges filed against building manager for disability discrimination." But the media didn't know the full story yet. They didn't know that the victim was a former federal judge who had orchestrated the entire investigation using her knowledge of federal law and her connections throughout the justice system. The revelation, the moment of truth, was coming, and Marcus was about to discover that his victim wasn't just any disabled resident. She was someone who had the power, knowledge, and connections to destroy his entire life. The formal mediation conference, arranged by HUD, was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. Marcus, accompanied by his attorney, walked into the federal building, expecting to face a routine housing discrimination complaint. Instead, he found himself in a room filled with federal prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, disability rights advocates, and HUD officials. But the biggest shock came when the mediator made the introductions. "Mr. Wellington, I'd like you to meet the complainant in this case. This is the Honorable Sarah Patterson, retired United States District Judge." The color completely drained from Marcus's face. His mouth fell open, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak. Sarah looked directly at Marcus with the same authoritative presence she had commanded in her federal courtroom for 30 years. "Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of legal authority, "for 6 months, you have systematically violated my federal civil rights, discriminated against me based on my disability, and threatened my housing security. You did this because you believed I was powerless to stop you. You were profoundly mistaken." Marcus's attorney, a young lawyer who had clearly not been prepared for this revelation, began frantically whispering in his client's ear. "Your Honor," the attorney stammered, "my client had no idea about your background. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding." Sarah's expression didn't change. "Counselor, ignorance of my professional background does not excuse your client's willful violation of federal law. The law protects all people with disabilities equally, regardless of their profession or social status." The plea anegotio nescist with the reality that he had discriminated against a federal judge, and with overwhelming evidence of his criminal behavior, Marcus's legal strategy quickly shifted to damage control. Federal prosecutors, led by Jennifer Rodriguez, offered Marcus a plea agreement: plead guilty to federal civil rights violations, accept a prison sentence of 18 months, pay substantial fines and restitution, and agree to never work in property management again. Justice is served. Marcus's sentencing hearing would become a landmark moment in federal civil rights law, sending a clear message that discrimination against people with disabilities would be met with the full force of federal prosecution. Marcus ultimately accepted the plea agreement, but his sentencing hearing was a powerful moment for the entire disability rights community. Sarah was invited to provide a victim impact statement, and her words were both personal and legally significant. "Your Honor, Mr. Wellington's actions against me were not just personal attacks. They were violations of the fundamental principles that make our society free and equal for all people. When someone in a position of authority systematically discriminates against people with disabilities, they attack the very foundation of civil rights that this country was built upon," she continued. "As someone who spent 30 years enforcing these laws from the federal bench, I understand the critical importance of holding violators accountable. Mr. Wellington's actions were not mistakes or oversights. They were deliberate, calculated violations of federal law designed to intimidate and exclude people with disabilities from equal participation in housing." The federal judge who sentenced Marcus, Judge William Thompson, had worked with Sarah for many years and knew her reputation well. "Mr. Wellington," Judge Thompson said during sentencing, "you have violated the civil rights of not just Judge Patterson, but multiple residents of your building. Your actions were willful, systematic, and showed a complete disregard for federal law and human dignity." Marcus was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. He was also ordered to pay $75,000 in fines and restitution, and was permanently barred from working in any position involving housing decisions. The broader Sarah's case had ripple effects throughout the region and beyond. The Department of Justice used the case as a training example for federal prosecutors handling civil rights violations. HUD incorporated the case into their Fair Housing Enforcement training materials. Pacific Northwest Property Management, facing potential criminal liability, agreed to pay Sarah a substantial civil settlement and implemented comprehensive reforms across all their properties. All employees received mandatory fair housing and disability rights training. Accessibility audits were conducted at every building. A company-wide policy was established requiring approval from civil rights attorneys before implementing any policies affecting residents with disabilities. An ombudsman position was created to handle discrimination complaints. The ongoing fight, but Sarah's victory, was about more than just personal justice. It became a catalyst for broader changes in how disability discrimination is prosecuted and prevented. Sarah began speaking at legal conferences about her experience, helping to train prosecutors, attorneys, and advocates on effective strategies for combating disability discrimination. She also worked with disability rights organizations to develop new approaches to documenting and prosecuting discrimination cases. "My case was unusual because I had the legal knowledge and professional connections to build a federal case," Sarah explained in interviews. "But every person with a disability deserves the same protection under federal law, regardless of their background or resources." Sarah's story inspired other people with disabilities who had faced discrimination to come forward. Her case became a model for how to effectively document discrimination and build cases that could result in meaningful consequences for violators. The personal TRNS for Sarah personally, EON for Sarah personally. The case marked a new chapter in her life's work. Having spent 30 years protecting civil rights from the bench, she now understood those rights from the perspective of someone who needed their protection. "This experience taught me that the laws I spent my career enforcing aren't just abstract legal principles," Sarah reflected. "They're essential protections that determine whether people with disabilities can participate fully in society." Sarah began mentoring young attorneys specializing in disability rights law, sharing both her legal expertise and her personal experience with discrimination. The building TRNS, NOR building, was completely transformed by the experience. The new management implemented accessibility improvements that went far beyond legal requirements. Audio announcements were added to elevators for residents with visual impairments. Braille signs were installed throughout the building. Accessible parking spaces were expanded and better marked. A resident advisory committee was established with rotating leadership, including residents with various disabilities. Regular accessibility audits were conducted to identify and address barriers. The building became a model for inclusive housing design and management, and other buildings in the area began implementing similar improvements to avoid the kind of federal scrutiny that had destroyed Marcus's career. The legacy today, 3 years after Marcus Wellington was sentenced to federal prison, Sarah's case continues to influence how disability discrimination cases are prosecuted and prevented across the country. The case established important legal precedents about the willful nature of discrimination and the federal penalties that can result from systematic civil rights violations. Law schools now study the case as an example of effective civil rights enforcement, and it's cited in legal briefs in discrimination cases throughout the country. But perhaps most importantly, the case sent a clear message to anyone who might consider discriminating against people with disabilities. Federal civil rights laws exist for a reason. There are serious consequences for violating them, and you never know who you might be targeting. The warning to OTH Wellington's story serves as a powerful warning to anyone in a position of authority who might be tempted to discriminate against people with disabilities. Marcus thought he could intimidate and control residents with disabilities because he perceived them as vulnerable and powerless. He saw Sarah's wheelchair and assumed she would be an easy target for his discrimination and abuse of authority. Instead, he discovered that he had targeted someone with the knowledge, connections, and determination to completely destroy his career and send him to federal prison. Federal civil rights laws don't exist just on paper. They have real enforcement mechanisms, and violations can result in criminal prosecution, substantial fines, and prison sentences. The message of Sarah's story is ultimately one of empowerment. It proves that knowledge is power, that standing up to discrimination is essential, and that justice can prevail even when the odds seem impossible. People with disabilities face discrimination every day, Sarah says. Most of the time, that discrimination goes unchallenged because people don't know their rights or don't believe they have the power to fight back. My case shows that federal civil rights laws are powerful tools for fighting discrimination, and that there are attorneys and advocates who will stand with people with disabilities when their rights are violated. The continuing ADVOCACY today, Sarah continues her civil rights work from a new perspective. She serves on the boards of several disability rights organizations, volunteers with legal aid societies, and continues to mentor young attorneys. She and Michael Chen have co-authored several law review articles about effective strategies for prosecuting disability discrimination cases, and their work has been cited in federal court decisions. Sarah also speaks regularly at conferences for building managers and property management companies, explaining federal disability rights laws and helping them understand how to avoid the kind of violations that destroyed Marcus's career. The final message, the most important lesson from Sarah's story, is that civil rights laws exist to protect everyone equally, and that there are real consequences for people who violate those rights. Marcus Wellington made the mistake of seeing Sarah's disability as a weakness he could exploit for his own sense of power and control. Instead, he discovered that he had attacked someone who possessed the knowledge, resources, and determination to expose his crimes and ensure he faced federal prosecution. But Sarah's disability didn't make her weak. It gave her first-hand experience with discrimination that, combined with her legal expertise, made her incredibly powerful in the fight for civil rights. The law doesn't care about your background, your profession, or your social status. It protects all people with disabilities equally, and those protections have real enforcement power behind them. Marcus learned this lesson the hard way from a federal prison cell. But his case has helped protect countless other people with disabilities from facing the same kind of systematic discrimination and abuse. Subscribe for JUS Tive 4, this incredible story of justice and spectacular revenge has you absolutely amazed. Then you need to smash that like button right now and subscribe to our channel immediately. Trust me when I tell you that we have dozens more mind-blowing stories of people who thought they were completely untouchable until they made the fatal mistake of messing with the wrong person. We're talking about HOA presidents who discovered they were terrorizing undercover federal agents, property managers who found out they were discriminating against retired Supreme Court justices, building superintendents who learned they had picked fights with people who could literally have them arrested with a single phone call. These stories of spectacular justice and well-deserved revenge will leave you cheering for the good guys and absolutely shocked at how far these bullies fell when karma finally caught up with them. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode of these incredible tales of justice served cold. We upload new stories of spectacular revenge and perfectly executed comebacks every single week. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single one. And here's what I want you to do right now. Drop a comment below and tell us about your own experiences with bullies, discriminators, or people who abused their authority. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who thought they could push you around? How did it turn out? We love hearing your stories, and some of the best ones might even become future episodes. Remember, knowledge is power. Standing up to discrimination isn't just the right thing to do. Sometimes it's literally the law. And you never know when the person you're messing with might have the power to completely destroy your entire life. Marcus Wellington learned that lesson from federal prison, but you can learn it right here for free. Keep fighting for justice. Keep standing up to bullies, and we'll see you in the next incredible tale of revenge, so sweet it'll give you chills. Until then, remember, never underestimate someone just because they look vulnerable, because you might just be picking a fight with someone who can end your career, your freedom, and your future with knowledge they carry in their head and a phone call to the right person.